She didn't come to prove anything. She was just visiting the range, uninvited, unnoticed, and clearly unwelcome. Two Delta Force operators watched her unpack a rifle with unsteady hands. One laughed. The other pulled out a crumpled $1,000 bill and slapped it on the bench. "Bet she can't even hold that thing straight," he said. The rest of the team chuckled. Then someone set the challenge. A candle, lit, 2,575 meters out. One shot. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing for more untold military stories that deserve to be shared. Fort Arcadian's shooting range shimmered under the Arizona sun as Echo Squadron prepared for their morning qualification drill. The elite Delta Force unit moved with practiced efficiency, each operator a study in lethal precision. Sergeant First Class Braddock examined his custom rifle, his weathered face betraying nothing as he made minute adjustments to his scope. Beside him, Master Sergeant Tavish cleaned his barrel with methodical care, his salt and pepper beard failing to hide a smirk as he shared a quiet joke about their commanding officer's latest impossible standards. "Vehicle approaching," announced Specialist Zarina, the only female operator in the unit. Her sharp eyes narrowed at the dust cloud rising from the access road. Colonel Kestrel emerged from the command post, watching the unmarked sedan with obvious displeasure. This wasn't scheduled. Echo Squadron didn't appreciate surprises. When the car stopped, the woman who emerged seemed entirely out of place. Laureline Rousseau stood barely 5'5", her slight frame draped in civilian clothes that hung loosely on her shoulders. Gray streaked through her haphazardly tied-back hair, and as she signed the security log, even from a distance, they could see her hands trembling. "Who ordered the pencil pusher?" Braddock muttered, just loud enough for nearby operators to hear. Colonel Kestrel's stride was stiff as he approached the visitor. Their conversation was brief, with Kestrel gesturing toward the firing line with obvious reluctance. "Listen up," he announced to the squadron. "This is a specialist from DARPA. She'll be observing today's qualification." Nothing more. No name, no credentials, no explanation. Laureline moved to an empty station, placing a long, weathered case on the bench. When she opened it, Tavish sidled closer, eyeing the custom rifle inside with professional curiosity that quickly turned to amusement as she struggled to assemble it, her hands shaking visibly. "Need help with that, ma'am?" he asked, not bothering to hide his condescension. "I'm fine, thank you," Laureline replied quietly, her voice carrying a faint accent that was difficult to place. Her fingers trembled as she attached the scope, dropping a specialized adjustment tool. The clatter drew snickers from nearby operators. Zarina, however, watched with more curiosity than derision, her eyes catching on something as Laureline's sleeve rode up, a glimpse of an unusual scar, partially visible on her forearm. "Never seen a civilian model like that," Braddock commented, nodding toward Laureline's rifle. "That's because it isn't civilian," Laureline answered simply, continuing her work. Her hands might have been unsteady, but her movements held the unmistakable efficiency of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. Still, as she loaded specialized ammunition, the tremors were impossible to ignore. Tavish's eyebrows rose as he pulled something from his pocket, a crumpled bill that he smoothed out deliberately before slapping it onto the bench beside her. "That's $1,000 says she can't even hold that thing straight," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The squadron gathered, forming an intimidating semicircle behind Laureline's station. Nobody offered help. Nobody showed respect. Colonel Kestrel watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. "Might as well make it interesting," Braddock said, keying his radio. "Team 2, set up a challenge at the far ridge." Through high-powered binoculars, they watched as figures appeared on a distant ridgeline, placing a single object that was difficult to make out through the heat waves rising from the desert floor. The digital rangefinder blinked, 2,575 meters. "Light it," Braddock ordered through his radio. A tiny flame appeared, barely visible even through scopes. "One shot," Tavish declared. "Put out the flame without touching the candle." Laughter rippled through the gathered operators. The challenge was absurd, a shot that would test the limits of the world's best snipers under perfect conditions, not someone whose hands couldn't stop shaking. Laureline said nothing. She simply checked the wind indicators, adjusted her scope, and unclipped a small device from her case, attaching it to her rifle with practiced movements despite the tremors. As she settled into position, The laughter quieted. Something in her absolute focus gave them pause. Her breathing slowed. Her trembling hands steadied incrementally as she prepared to take the shot. Specialist Zarina stepped closer, watching with increasing interest as Laureline went through a ritual that seemed both foreign and eerily familiar. The visitor's process was methodical despite her trembling hands, checking ambient conditions, making micro-adjustments to her scope, and testing the wind with a precision that belied her apparent physical limitations. "She's wasting our time," another operator muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Something about Laureline's focus had created an unexpected tension on the range. Colonel Kestrel moved to stand behind Laureline, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by quiet observation. He'd seen this level of concentration before, but rarely outside combat zones. Laureline's world narrowed to the task before her. The operator's mockery faded into background noise as she ran through her mental checklist. Wind direction, crosswind from the northwest, approximately 8 mph. Temperature 92 degrees Celsius and rising. Humidity 15%, typical for the Arizona desert. Barometric pressure, stable. She made final adjustments to her scope, accounting for the Coriolis effect at this extreme distance. The small device she'd attached to her rifle, her prototype, hummed almost imperceptibly as its sensors calibrated to her specific tremor pattern. Through her scope, the candle wavered in and out of focus, not because of the distance or heat waves, but because of her hands. The prototype compensated, its microgyroscopes and predictive algorithm working in concert with her muscle memory. A brief flash crossed her mind, her hands, steady as stone, threading a needle at 1,800 meters during Operation Kingfisher. The target? A bomb maker surrounded by civilians. The window for the shot, less than 3 seconds. She had made it without hesitation. Then came Rabat, where the first tremors had begun, just as she prepared to take the most critical shot of her career. She pushed the memory away. Tavish leaned closer to Braddock. "This is embarrassing. Should we call it off?" "Let her fail on her own terms," Braddock replied, not unkindly. Zarina stood apart from the others, her eyes narrowed in thought as she studied the visitor more carefully. The scar on Laureline's arm, she'd seen that pattern before, in a classified file she wasn't supposed to have access to. Laureline exhaled slowly, her finger curling around the trigger with delicate precision. Despite the tremors that ran through her arm, the prototype maintained the barrel's position with microscopic adjustments, counterbalancing her involuntary movements. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressor muffled what would have been a thunderous report, reducing it to little more than a whisper. The bullet cut through the air, traveling the extreme distance in just over 7 seconds. Through their scopes and binoculars, Echo Squadron watched the distant candle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without drama or fanfare, the flames simply vanished. The candle itself remained perfectly intact, undisturbed on its stand. The range fell silent. Braddock lowered his binoculars slowly, disbelief evident in his expression. Tavish stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. Even Colonel Kestrel seemed stunned, though he recovered more quickly than the others. "That's," Tavish began, unable to find words. "Impossible," Braddock finished for him. Zarina stepped forward, gently taking Laureline's arm and rolling up her sleeve to reveal the full insignia scar, an ultra-classified mark that few would recognize but that carried immense significance to those who knew. "Your Nightshade," Zarina said quietly, using the call sign with reverence. Colonel Kestrel approached, his demeanor entirely transformed. "I'd like to formally introduce Lieutenant Colonel Laureline Rousseau," he announced to the squadron. 20 years with 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, 37 confirmed eliminations beyond 2,000 meters, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for an operation none of you have clearance to know about. The operators stared in stunned silence as their commander continued. 3 years ago, Lieutenant Colonel Rousseau was exposed to an experimental chemical agent while preventing a terrorist attack in Rabat. It caused permanent neurological damage resulting in the tremors you've been mocking. Tavish's face flushed with shame as he looked down at the $1,000 bill still lying on the bench. "Since then," Kestrel continued, "she's been developing adaptive technology for operators with combat-induced tremors, PTSD, and neurological injuries. The device on her rifle is a prototype. That's why she's here." Understanding dawned across the faces of Echo Squadron. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, And underestimated wasn't some bureaucrat or engineer. She was a legend among special operators, one whose exploits were whispered about in the most classified circles. Tavish approached Laureline slowly. He picked up his $1,000 bill, but instead of returning it to his pocket, he placed it in her hand and stood at attention, offering a respectful salute. One by one, the other operators followed suit, forming a line of silent respect for the woman who had just accomplished the impossible despite her limitations. Colonel Kestrel gestured toward the command center. "Lieutenant Colonel, if you join me, I believe we have some details to discuss about implementation." As Laureline packed her rifle, her hands still trembling, Zarina approached her again. "The device," she said quietly, "it compensates for involuntary muscle movements?" Laureline nodded. "And adapts in real time to changing tremor patterns. It's still in development, but today was a significant field test." "You could have told us who you were," Zarina noted. "It would have spared you the disrespect." "Would it have proven anything?" Laureline countered. "The device doesn't work because of who I am. It works because it's designed to overcome a specific problem." She glanced at the distant ridge where the candle still stood, its flame extinguished by a shot that should have been impossible. "Sometimes the only way to demonstrate value is through action, not identity." Zarina nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You needed genuine skepticism to prove the technology's worth." "Exactly," Laureline replied, securing the last components of her rifle case. "Belief can bias results. Doubt forces genuine demonstration." As Laureline followed Colonel Kestrel toward the command center, the members of Echo Squadron remained at the firing line, their earlier mockery replaced by subdued contemplation. Tavish examined his own hands, flexing them slowly as if seeing them for the first time. "Something you want to share, Master Sergeant?" Braddock asked, noticing the gesture. Tavish shook his head. "Not yet," he replied, watching Laureline's retreating figure. "But maybe soon." 3 months later, Fort Arcadian's range had transformed. Where once there had been only traditional equipment, now there were stations outfitted with Laureline's adaptive technology, devices that compensated for various forms of tremors, from neurological damage to combat stress. Echo Squadron had become the test unit for the prototype, with remarkable results. Operators who had been struggling with the early signs of stress-induced tremors found their accuracy restored. Those dealing with injuries had new hope for remaining in the field. Master Sergeant Tavish worked closely with Laureline, having finally admitted what he'd been hiding for months. His own hands had begun to betray him after 17 years of service and 8 deployments. His fear of being removed from duty had led him to conceal the developing tremors, making him particularly hostile toward the woman he'd perceived as a threat. "I should have recognized what you were doing from the start," he told her, as they calibrated a new version of the device for his specific tremor pattern. "Instead, I let pride blind me." Laureline adjusted a setting on the prototype. "Pride keeps us alive in the field," she replied. "It only becomes a problem when it prevents us from adapting." Across the range, Colonel Kestrel reviewed performance data with Specialist Zarina, who had been assigned as the project's liaison. The numbers showed a 42% improvement in accuracy for operators with stress-induced tremors using Laureline's technology. "The Pentagon is impressed," Kestrel noted. "They're talking about fast-tracking this for wider deployment." "What changed their minds?" Zarina asked. 3 months ago, they wouldn't even consider it." "Results speak louder than proposals," Kestrel replied, watching as Sergeant First Class Braddock hit 3 consecutive targets at 200 meters, despite the coffee jitters he'd deliberately induced to test the system's limits. Later that day, Zarina found Laureline alone at the farthest firing station, making adjustments to her original prototype. "You knew who I was from the beginning," Laureline said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Zarina nodded. "I accessed your file after Rabat. It wasn't officially available, but I have certain skills." "Yet you said nothing." "It wasn't my place," Zarina replied. "But I have to ask, why didn't you simply tell everyone who you were from the beginning? It would have saved you the disrespect." Laureline set down her tools, her hands trembling slightly as they always did. "Innovation isn't accepted because of who creates it. It's accepted when it proves itself." She glanced at the range where operators were hitting targets they couldn't before. "Besides, I didn't come to prove anything. I came to help soldiers like me have a second chance. The following week, Fort Arcadian's memorial wall became the backdrop for a small ceremony. Echo Squadron stood in formation as Loreline's technology was officially incorporated into their equipment. General Hayward, who had flown in specifically for the occasion, spoke briefly about adaptation and resilience. After the formalities concluded, Braddock approached Loreline, something clutched in his hand. "I never apologized," he said, his usual gruffness softened by genuine remorse, "for how we treated you that first day." "It's forgotten," Loreline assured him. Braddock unfolded a worn photograph, showing a younger version of himself beside another man in uniform, their resemblance unmistakable. "My brother, Callum, Force Recon sniper. He took his own life 2 years ago after a spinal injury ended his career." His voice roughened with emotion. "He could have used someone like you, someone who understood that it's not over just because something changes." Loreline accepted the photo, studying it briefly before returning it. What was his favorite distance? 800 meters. He said it was where skill met artistry. "Bring his rifle tomorrow," she said. "We'll see what it can do with the new prototype." The image of Braddock's face, hope breaking through grief like sunlight through storm clouds, stayed with Loreline that evening as she reviewed her project notes in her temporary quarters. Her own hands trembled as they always did, but the tremors seemed worse tonight, a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd gained. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Colonel Kestrel stood in the hallway, a file folder in his hands. "The Pentagon called," he said without preamble. "They want to discuss expansion of the program." Loreline gestured for him to enter. "That's good news?" "It is," Kestrel agreed. "But there's a complication. They want to reassign you to a research facility in Virginia. Echo Squadron would continue as your test group, but remotely." Loreline considered this. "The in-person calibrations are essential for these early prototypes." "I made that clear," Kestrel said, handing her the folder. "This is their compromise proposal." Inside was a transfer order, not for her, but for Echo Squadron. Temporary deployment to the Virginia facility for 3 months of intensive testing and development. "The entire squadron?" Loreline asked, surprised. "Your results have caught serious attention," Kestrel replied. "The applications extend beyond Delta. They're looking at implementation across multiple special operations groups, including those with operators dealing with long-term combat injuries." Loreline nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" 3 days, Kestrel said. "There's one other thing." He pulled a smaller envelope from his pocket. This came directly from the Secretary of Defense. Inside was a formal reinstatement offer, not to active field duty, but to a newly created position overseeing adaptive technology implementation for Special Operations Forces. The tremors that had ended her field career could become the foundation for a new chapter, not just for her, but for countless others. "I'll need time to think about this," Loreline said. Kestrel nodded. "Of course, but for what it's worth, I've never seen Echo Squadron adapt to new technology this quickly. They respect you, and after seeing what your device can do, so do I." After he left, Loreline sat with the paperwork spread before her, considering the path that had led her here. The shot that had silenced Echo Squadron 3 months ago wasn't just a demonstration. It was a reclamation of something she'd thought forever lost. The next morning, Loreline arrived at the range to find Braddock waiting, a weathered rifle case at his feet. "Callum's," he said simply, opening it to reveal a meticulously maintained M40A5. Together, they fitted the adaptive device to the rifle, making adjustments for its specific weight and balance. When Braddock lifted it to his shoulder, his expression was complex, grief and hope intermingled. "I never fired it after he died," Braddock admitted. "Couldn't bring myself to." "Today you're not just firing it," Loreline told him. "You're continuing what he started." They set up at the 800-meter mark, Callum's preferred distance. The target was standard, nothing as dramatic as a candle flame, but it carried its own significance. Braddock's hands were steady as he took his position, but Loreline knew the emotional tremors that could affect a shot just as much as physical ones. The adaptive device wouldn't compensate for those, but perhaps the ritual itself could. "When you're ready," she said quietly, stepping back. Braddock exhaled slowly, then fired 3 shots in rapid succession. 3 perfect hits, grouped so tightly they formed a single hole in the center of the target. He lowered the rifle, staring at the distant target for a long moment before turning to Laureline. "Thank you," he said simply. Word of the Virginia deployment spread quickly through Echo Squadron. For most, it was a welcome development, a chance to be at the forefront of a technology that could redefine operational parameters for special forces. For Tavish, however, it represented something more personal. As Laureline calibrated the latest prototype to his specific tremor pattern, he finally voiced what had been troubling him. "What happens after the 3 months?" he asked. "When the program goes mainstream?" Laureline understood the real question. "The device doesn't cure the tremors," she said, "but it compensates for them. As long as you can maintain operational standards with it, there's no medical reason for disqualification." Relief washed over Tavish's face. "So I could stay with the squadron." "That's the goal," Laureline confirmed. "Not just for you, but for anyone dealing with similar challenges." 2 days before their scheduled departure for Virginia, Laureline received another visitor, Specialist Zarina, carrying a secure tablet. "You need to see this," Zarina said, activating the tablet's biometric security. "It just came through classified channels." The screen displayed surveillance footage from a compound in North Africa. A group of figures moved through the shadows, carrying what appeared to be chemical containers. The same group from Rabat, Laureline recognized immediately. "The ones responsible for the agent that caused my tremors." Zarina nodded grimly. "Intelligence suggests they've refined it, potentially weaponized it for wider deployment." Laureline studied the footage, memories of her last mission flooding back, the intelligence failure that had left her exposed, the silent enemy that had invaded her nervous system, the career that had ended in a hospital bed as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. "Why show me this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because the mission parameters require a specialist with your expertise," Zarina replied. "Someone who understands the target's capabilities and limitations." "I'm not field ready," Laureline said, holding up her trembling hands. "Even with the adaptive device, I'm not cleared for combat operations." "You wouldn't be on the ground team," Zarina clarified. "You'd be overseeing the operation from the Tactical Operations Center. Your knowledge of the group's methods is invaluable." Laureline considered this, studying the figures on the screen. "When?" "The operation window opens tomorrow night. It would delay our departure for Virginia by a week at most." "Does Colonel Kestrel know about this?" "He's the one who authorized me to bring it to you," Zarina replied. "The decision is yours, but Echo Squadron has been specifically requested for this operation. Given the nature of the threat, it seemed appropriate." Laureline nodded slowly. "Brief the team. I'll review the intelligence package and be at the TOC in 3 hours." After Zarina left, Laureline stood at her window, watching the activity on the range below. Echo Squadron was running final qualification drills before their departure, their movements precise, their shots accurate even with the deliberate stressors introduced to test the adaptive devices. They had become more than test subjects over these past months. They had become, in a way she hadn't anticipated, her new unit, her new purpose. The mission ahead carried personal significance, but it also represented something larger, a chance to prevent others from experiencing what she had endured. The chemical agent that had ended her field career might never have a cure, but she had found a way to adapt, to continue serving in a new capacity. As she watched Echo Squadron complete their drills, Laureline felt a sense of completion. The shot that had silenced them 3 months ago wasn't just a demonstration of technology. It was the beginning of a transformation, both for them and for her. Her hands would never be steady again. But perhaps they didn't need to be. The Tactical Operations Center hummed with controlled urgency as Echo Squadron prepared for deployment. Screens displayed satellite imagery of the North African compound, thermal signatures indicating at least 12 hostiles moving between structures. Laureline stood at the central console, her trembling hands resting lightly on the edge as she briefed the team. Despite not being in the field, she wore her old mission gear, a habit from years of operational planning. "The target is Amir Khalil," she explained, bringing up a grainy image on the main screen. "Chemical weapons specialist formerly employed by the Syrian government. 3 years ago in Rabat, his team was developing a neurotoxin designed to incapacitate without killing." "The same agent that caused your tremors," Tavish stated, his expression grim. Laureline nodded. Intelligence suggests they've refined it for wider deployment. If weaponized, it could disable entire military units without setting off conventional chemical weapons detectors. Colonel Kestrel joined them at the console. Our mission is straightforward: neutralize the threat, secure any research materials, and extract without engagement if possible. And if engagement becomes necessary? Braddock asked. That's where these come in, Laureline replied, gesturing to a case containing the latest versions of her adaptive devices. Your standard kit has been upgraded with countermeasures specific to Khalil's agents. The filtration systems should provide protection against airborne variants. Zarina studied the compound layout. Extraction point? Here, Laureline indicated a clearing 2 kilometers from the target. Once you've secured the objective, you'll have a 20-minute window for helicopter extraction. As Echo Squadron made final preparations, Kestrel drew Laureline aside. Are you certain you're comfortable running tactical on this, given your history with the target? Laureline's hands trembled slightly more than usual, the only outward sign of her tension. I'm the most qualified person to identify his methods, and I trust this team to execute. Kestrel nodded once, respecting her decision. TOC is yours then. The mission launched at 0200 local time under cloud cover that provided natural concealment for the approaching team. Laureline monitored their progress from the TOC, her focus absolute as she tracked multiple feeds simultaneously. Eagle 1 in position, came Tavish's voice through the comm system. No movement on the perimeter. Proceed with infiltration, Laureline directed, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Remember, we want Khalil alive if possible. The operation proceeded with textbook precision until the team reached the main laboratory structure. Thermal imaging showed an unexpected concentration of heat signatures. I'm counting 15 tangos, Braddock reported quietly. More than intel suggested. Laureline studied the pattern of movement. Something felt wrong. Hold position, she ordered. The heat signatures are too uniform. Check for alternative sources. Zarina, operating as the team's technical specialist, deployed a micro-drone through a ventilation shaft. Its camera revealed the truth. The heat signatures weren't people but carefully arranged heating elements designed to mimic human presence. It's a diversion, Laureline realized, immediately scanning other structures. Khalil knows we're coming. Check the secondary building to the north. The team repositioned quickly, approaching the unmarked structure that intelligence had designated as storage. Thermal imaging showed only 2 heat signatures inside. Proceed with caution, Laureline advised. Khalil likely has the agent ready for deployment. Echo Squadron breached the building with precision, only to find it mostly empty except for a single figure seated calmly at a desk. Amir Khalil looked older than his file photo, his face lined with years of stress, but his eyes held the same calculating intelligence. I've been expecting you, he said in accented English. Though not quite so soon. Where is the agent? Tavish demanded, his weapon trained on Khalil. The scientist smiled thinly. Already deployed. You've been breathing it for the past 3 minutes. At that moment, alarms blared in the TOC as environmental sensors on the team's equipment registered a chemical presence. Full masks, Laureline ordered immediately. Initiate countermeasure protocol Alpha. Echo Squadron responded with practiced efficiency, but Laureline could already see the first signs of effect. Subtle tremors in Braddock's hands as he secured his mask, a momentary hesitation in Zarina's movements. The filtration won't help, Khalil informed them calmly. This variant is absorbed through the skin. Quite fascinating, really. It targets the central nervous system with remarkable specificity. Laureline's mind raced. The countermeasures they'd prepared were designed for the original agent, not this new variant. She needed to adapt, quickly. Zarina, check your medkit for atropine derivatives, she instructed. They might slow the absorption rate. Already on it, Zarina replied, her voice steady despite the visible tremor beginning in her hands. Khalil watched with scientific curiosity. Impressive response time, but ultimately futile. Where's the research? Tavish demanded. The formulas, the production methods. Khalil tapped his temple. All here. I learned long ago not to trust physical records. In the TOC, Laureline made a decision. Change of mission parameters, she announced. Secure Khalil for immediate extraction. Leave the site investigation for the follow-up team. And the agent? Kestrel asked from beside her. Echo Squadron has been exposed, Laureline replied grimly. Our priority now is getting them treatment before neurological damage becomes permanent. On screen, she could see the team already experiencing increasing symptoms. The same progressive tremors that had ended her field career were now affecting them all. Yet they moved with determined precision, securing Khalil and initiating extraction procedures. "There is no treatment," Khalil informed them as they escorted him from the building. "The effects are permanent, as your tactical officer well knows." Braddock tightened his grip on the scientist's arm. "She also knows how to adapt." The extraction proceeded under increasingly difficult conditions as the team's symptoms progressed. By the time they reached the helicopter, even Tavish, with his years of experience, was struggling to maintain his weapon grip. Loreline watched from the TOC, her own hands trembling in sympathetic understanding of what they were experiencing. As the helicopter lifted off, she turned to Kestrel. "I need a direct line to the medical team at Fort Arcadian and full access to our research files on the adaptive technology." Kestrel nodded, already making the necessary arrangements. "You think you can adapt the devices for this new variant?" "I have to," Loreline replied simply. 72 hours later, Echo Squadron was back at Fort Arcadian, confined to the medical wing as the full effects of their exposure manifested. Loreline worked tirelessly, splitting her time between the research lab and the medical facility, pushing the adaptive technology in new directions. Khalil, secured in a high-security detention area, had begun to cooperate, providing insights into his agent's mechanism of action in exchange for certain accommodations. His scientific curiosity seemed piqued by Loreline's adaptive technology. "You turned your disability into an advantage," he noted during one interrogation session. "Quite ingenious." Loreline regarded him without expression. "Not a disability, a challenge." "Semantics," Khalil replied with a shrug. "Either way, you adapted. Most wouldn't have had the resilience." "Neither will you if you don't provide the formula for an effective countermeasure," Loreline countered. Khalil smiled thinly. "There is none. The neural pathways once altered remain so permanently. But perhaps your approach has merit. Adaptation rather than reversal." With this reluctant guidance, Loreline refined her prototypes, working through nights as Echo Squadron's conditions stabilized into the familiar pattern she knew all too well: permanent tremors that varied in intensity but never disappeared. 5 days after their return, she entered the medical wing with a case containing her latest modifications. Echo Squadron waited, seated together in the recovery room, their hands displaying the unmistakable tremors of Khalil's agent. "These won't cure the tremors," Loreline told them honestly, opening the case to reveal the new devices. "Nothing will, but they should allow you to maintain operational capabilities despite them." She distributed the specialized attachments, each calibrated for the individual operator's specific tremor pattern. Tavish was the first to test his, attaching it to a training rifle and taking aim at a target across the room. His hands trembled visibly, but when he squeezed the trigger, the shot hit dead center. One by one, the others tested their devices, each finding the same result. The technology compensated for their tremors with remarkable precision, allowing them to maintain the accuracy their roles demanded. "We deploy to Virginia next week," Colonel Kestrel announced, entering the room. "The Secretary of Defense has taken personal interest in your case. The Adaptive Technology Program has been given top priority for development and implementation across special operations groups." "Will we remain operational?" Braddock asked the question they all wanted answered. Kestrel nodded. "With the adaptive technology, you meet all qualification standards. Echo Squadron remains intact, with one addition." He turned to Loreline. "Lieutenant Colonel Rousseau has been officially assigned as your technical advisor and will deploy with you to Virginia." The following morning, Loreline found Zarina at the range, testing her adaptive device on increasingly difficult targets. "How does it feel?" Loreline asked, watching as Zarina hit a target at 1,000 meters despite her trembling hands. "Different," Zarina admitted, "but effective." She lowered the rifle, studying her shaking hands. "You lived with this for 3 years before creating the solution." "I had motivation," Loreline replied. "And now, so do you." 2 weeks later, Fort Arcadian's range had been transformed into a demonstration area for visiting military officials. Echo Squadron, now recognized as the first adaptive technology unit, demonstrated their capabilities for an audience that included the Secretary of Defense and representatives from allied nations. The highlight came when Tavish, whose tremors had become the most pronounced of the group, extinguished a candle flame at 2,000 meters, not quite matching Loreline's original demonstration, but impressive nonetheless given his condition. 3 months ago, I thought my career was over, he told the assembled officials. The tremors would have disqualified me from any operational role. This technology didn't cure me, it allowed me to adapt. The final demonstration fell to Loreline herself. Standing at the firing line, her hands trembling as they had for years, she assembled her rifle with practiced efficiency despite the tremors. The target, a candle flame at 2,575 meters, the same challenge that had first silenced Echo Squadron's doubts. She attached her latest prototype, took her position, and exhaled slowly. The shot, when it came, was virtually silent. Through high-powered scopes, the officials watched as the distant flame vanished, leaving the candle untouched. Applause followed, but Loreline's attention was on Echo Squadron, the team that had gone from mocking her trembling hands to sharing her condition and her solution. Later that day, as preparations for their Virginia deployment continued, Loreline found herself at the Fort Arcadian Memorial Wall. Among the names of fallen operators was Callum Braddock, the brother whose loss had given her work personal meaning for his surviving sibling. Sergeant First Class Braddock joined her there, his hands trembling in the same rhythm that now affected them all. He would have appreciated the irony, Braddock said quietly, that his death indirectly led to a solution that keeps others in the field. Not just a solution, Loreline corrected, a new beginning. As Echo Squadron completed their final preparations, Loreline surveyed what they had become, not diminished by their condition, but transformed by it. The tremors that might have ended their careers had instead pioneered a new approach to operational readiness. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet courage changed lives without fanfare or glory? For Echo Squadron, that person was Lieutenant Colonel Loreline Rousseau, the woman who couldn't hold a gun steady, yet extinguished a flame at 2,575 meters with a single shot. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more untold military stories that deserve to be shared.